The public has a long-held fascination with detectives. Detectives see a side of life the average person is never exposed to. In this podcast series, I Catch Killers with Gary Jubilant, I'll be interviewing a whole range of people you come across as a detective, including police, bad guys and victims. I spent 34 years as a cop. For 25 of those years I was catching killers. That's what I did for a living. I was a homicide detective. I'm no longer just interviewing bad guys. Instead, I'm taking the public into the world in which I operated. The guests I selected have amazing stories from all sides of the law. The interviews are raw and honest, just like the world they inhabited. No one who steps into the world of crime comes out unchanged. Join me now while I take you into this world. This episode of I Catch Killers contains conversations that some listeners may find confronting or triggering. Discretion is advised. Welcome to another episode of I Catch Killers. Today we're going to take you into the mind of the criminal, as viewed through the eyes of one of the country's most experienced criminal psychologists. Working as a criminal psychologist is no place for the faint-hearted. Due to the subject topic of today's podcast, I think it's appropriate to give out a listener warning. We're going to be discussing some very dark subjects, which some people may find confronting. Our guest's career started in 1978 as a fresh-faced, naive young psychologist who was thrown in the deep end, working in Parramatta Jail, which housed some very dark souls. Clearly, he managed to keep his head above the surface because since that time, he has assessed literally thousands of clients, the majority of which have committed criminal offences. He has also appeared in courts across the country as an expert witness thousands of times. He's one of Australia's most distinguished criminal psychologists and has been involved in some of the country's most notorious court cases. These include the Hoddle Street gunman, Julian Knight, who killed 7 people and injured 19 others in a shooting spree in Melbourne in 1987, corporate fraudster Alan Bond, Melbourne gangster Alphonse Ganetano, and murdered bikie Mick Howie, just to name a few. He is also an author, an academic, and a very interesting person. Delving into the minds of some of the country's worst criminals takes a toll, and there were times in his life when he had to face his own demons. One of his books, Dancing with Demons, The True Life Misadventures of a Criminal Psychologist, is described by journalist Hugh Remington as a tale of tragedy, folly and redemption from a man who has seen it all. I was so excited when he agreed to come on the podcast. Tim Watson-Munro, welcome to I Catch Killers.
G'day, Gary. Boy, what a build-up. Thank you.
I have the expectation to be able to live up to it.
I hope we don't disappoint.
Without putting pressure. You've certainly had an interesting time in your chosen career.
It's been quite a ride, and it's not for the faint-hearted. Last August, it was 42 years in the saddle. I remember the time I walked into Parramatta Jail for the first time. It was the 14th of August, 1978. And I was 25, I looked about 18, I was half my current body weight, and I was overpowered by the smell of Lysol and wolf whistles from the Crims, who thought I was pretty cute. I went in to see the Governor, Harry Duff, and he said, "Welcome aboard, son. I've just got one message for you, and I don't want to offend the listeners." He said, "Remember this, if you can be conned, you can be fucked." The last psycho lasted 3 months, and Godspeed. And with that, I started my career. That was quite a powerful moment in my life, as you can imagine.
That is, it's jumping in the deep end. At 25, you think you know everything, but...
I came from a sort of gentrified existence. My late father was a professor of physics at Sydney University. My mother was an artist. I'd had this sort of silver spoon life. And people counselled me against taking this job when I was fortunate enough to be offered it. They said, "It's going to destroy you, you'll change." You know, I played guitar, I played piano, I was creative, but it was those things that really, I think, drove me to work there because I wanted to experience something entirely different. And I've not been disappointed. It's been an amazing career and one I'm very grateful for.
Is it true, you told me a story over a beer that bets were placed on how long you would last?
Yeah, that's right. I became mates with the Governor in a short period of time, and I found the best way to get things done in the jail was to adjourn to the Northmead Bowling Club at 3 o'clock because he loved a schooner and I started to love them. I had no choice. And with the inflection of time, he said to me, "You know, Tim, you're doing a great job. When you started, we ran a book on how long you would last. The last guy lasted 3 months. The best you could get was about a month or two. And I said, thanks for the vote of confidence. Well, this was about a year in, and I'd established my credentials. But yeah, people would go there and pivot out straight away. It was such an overwhelming environment for many.
Parramatta Jail had a reputation that I picked up on. Just going there, you could feel it had a certain sense of foreboding when you walked through those gates. But speaking to the old crooks and some of the prison officers, everyone said it was such a violent place.
Extraordinarily violent at times, and you could walk through the gate on some days and you knew something was going down. The tension was palpable. And the last year I worked there, which was in 81, 3 guys were murdered during the last 6 months that I was there. It was all over internecine drug wars between 3-wing and 6-wing. But quite apart from the murders, there were daily bashings. There were all sorts of things that went on, rapes and all the rest of it. So getting back to my tender age of 25, it was quite an eye-opener for me. A very steep learning curve, but it set me up for going into private practice some time after that,
Yeah. So 42 years in this line of work. Has the Tim that walked into the jail at 25 to what you are now changed greatly? It's had an effect on you?
Inevitably, it had a big effect on me, and we'll talk about that later. But I think the core Tim hasn't changed. And it's funny, 20 years ago, I sort of hit the wall. I was so successful and full of bullshit, really, that I lost my way. But I'm back to being sort of an empathic guy, humble. And, I look back with some pride over my career. But inevitably, when you spend every day of your working life dealing with mayhem, chaos and violence, it has an impact upon you, and it certainly has had one on me over the years.
So the role of a psychologist and going into the prison, what was your role? And it's to unravel the mind of the criminal? What purpose did you serve?
I was a jack of all trades, really. It was really primarily to support prisoners. So inevitably they would experience Dear John letters where their wives and partners would write in, typically within the first 2 years of a long sentence, and they'd be dumped. It was to deal with the tensions that were going on between various criminals within the jail. I sat on the classification committee at Long Bay. So once a month I'd go out to Long Bay and assess prisoners to see where they would be dispatched. I was involved in training prison officers and recruiting prison officers. We set up the special care unit at Long Bay, which is a therapeutic community within the jail at Long Bay. I was involved in training the prison officers there with other psychologists. And eventually, as they came to trust me, I had a number of prison officers that wanted help as well. So it was a very generic role, and it was an amazing experience.
Would it be a relatively new field?
It was then. Statewide in New South Wales, there were 20 psychologists.
Right.
And it was not considered a specialty. It became one. And with the passage of time, I became involved with the Australian Psychological Society. We set up the Forensic College of the Australian Psychological Society. I was a foundation member and became chairman of that group. Later on down the track, when I'd moved to Melbourne, I was involved in setting up with the Department of Criminology at Melbourne University, the first professional doctorate in forensic psychology. And so now it's a highly specialised branch of psychology, and there's hundreds of people that work in the system, either as private practitioners or consulting to government. But back, 42 years ago, we were pioneers in many ways. We didn't have any real direction. We had to be self-directed, and it was very new. And psychologists weren't accepted within the prison system in the way they are today. So you had to sort out all the politics of the jail that you were working in on a daily basis, really.
And not a criticism of the prison officers, but I would imagine in that time, in that era, you're not in there to help it's a punishment. Jail was punishment, and you're not in there to help the prisoners. So there would have been a bit of a strange look at what your role in there.
Oh, look, they thought we were crim lovers, and, they didn't see any role for us
considered a
at all.
do-gooder.
A do-gooder, yeah. And we were there to do good, no argument, but we were to do good for the prison.
Yeah.
And when they recognised that actually we could be safety valves for the crooks so they wouldn't go and bash other crooks, they wouldn't spit at prison officers and so on, they came to see the value in what we were doing. But I had to really get involved with the prison officers in a very gradual and subtle way, because there was a lot of hostility to start with.
Yeah.
And then I started playing football with them after work, and,
break down the barriers.
Yeah, I'd have a beer with them up at the Northmead Bowling Club. Harry Duff was a great asset as the governor. I mean, he gave me his imprimatur and they accepted me on that basis.
Yeah.
But you had to be nimble to get through it all.
Yeah. Some of the prisoners that you can recall from those days, and the different types of prisoners that you would encounter, because my understanding of prison, and in the limited times that I've stepped inside, but people I know that I've sent there and people who have come out, there's all sorts of prisoners in there. The ones that really are not meant for prisons, the others that seem to thrive on it. What was the dynamics of the prisoners?
By and large then, it was considered to be an end-of-the-line jail. So when they closed down Jaka, which was the 70s version of Supermax at Goulburn, a lot of those prisoners came to Parramatta. So they were heavy-duty crooks, a lot of lifers, armed robbers, rapists, on average.
Jaka, is that the Katingal? We know there's...
Oh, sorry, did I say... a territorial dispute. Yeah. I was thinking I was in Victoria for a moment. It's COVID. Katingal.
We should open these borders. Looks what happens.
I think
when
they should too. Katingal, which was the equivalent of Supermax.
That's where you had Russell Mad Dog Cox and all the intractable prisoners.
Yeah, Bernie Matthews came from there.
Yeah.
And Cox didn't go to Parramatta. Bernie Matthews did. Highly talented guy.
Yeah.
He ended up writing books and becoming a journalist.
What was his story?
Well, he was defined as an intractable. He was an armed robber, highly intelligent guy. And he was the bloke who said to me, jails are nothing more than the universities of higher crime. He had started out in the system in boys' homes, worked his way through. He'd been brutalised, and it sort of went from there. I still have contact with Bernie. He's a very interesting guy, and he's a guy you should think about getting on your show, actually. He'd be an interesting bloke for you to talk to. But it was generally these intractable recidivist prisoners, which, again, contributed to my rapid learning. But the benefit of that was that they weren't going anywhere. A lot of the other jails are just holding jails, and so you want to get a program up and running. It's very hard because the prisoners that you train to be involved in that program...
get moved or
they get
reclassified.
moved. Yeah. Yep. Parramatta, they weren't going anywhere. So we set up things like the Parramatta Recidivist Group, which was a program designed for juvenile offenders to spend a day in jail. There were a range of programs that were established because the prisoners weren't going anywhere. Yeah. And one of these was the Parramatta Recidivist Group, where juvenile offenders were sent to jail for a day. And they were well protected, but they lived the day as a prisoner, so they were received into the prison, strip-searched, fingerprinted. All that stuff was destroyed at the end of the day. They spent the morning doing menial jail chores, which back in the 70s was polishing locks. Yeah. They were locked up for 2 hours over the lunch period. They were given jail food, which was atrocious. And then in the afternoon, they were counselled by 4 hand-picked prisoners out of a pool of about 10. And it was experiential learning. So if the kid was sent to jail because he was stealing cars, which was very popular in the 70s, the crook would say, look, I started out stealing cars and I'm now doing 15 on the bottom for murder and life. And it was evaluated by the Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research in New South Wales. It was shown to be highly effective. We set up a drug treatment program.
Just on that, Tim, have they continued on with those programs?
Not that I'm aware of.
Because I remember that was starting to get some spotlight on it, the program, and knowing young crooks as I do, coming up through the police and watching, that's the time that you can change them, in my view.
Absolutely.
And I thought it had a lot of merit to it, the program. Do you know why it...
Oh, look, politics, changes of government.
Yeah.
I mean, you talk about getting a lot of light. We were invited onto the Mike Walsh show in the 80s. I'll
Yeah.
never forget this day, because I persuaded Harry Duff to let two of the prisoners come onto the Mike Walsh show with me.
Yeah.
And they weren't going anywhere, but they were allowed to do this. And we went into Channel 9 studios, and these guys hadn't seen sunshine for 10 years, so they still had the clothes of 10 years earlier, bell-bottom pants and all that stuff. It was hilarious. And as it eventuated... Well, they were just happy to be out for a day. We went down in the government fair lane, and they were cuffed, and it was a live audience. But Mike Walsh was sick, and Jimmy Hannon was filling in, and he hadn't been briefed properly. So he was sort of going whiter and whiter. You've got a guy who's killed his wife, and another guy's, held up about 20 banks. He's never going to get out. Yeah. And at the end of it, he said to one guy, it was Ray Annesley, I think, he said, "Why are you in jail?" And he said, "I killed my wife and I'm very sorry." Yeah. And the other guy was a bloke by the name of Brown. And "Why are you in jail?" And he said, "Well, I've robbed all these banks and I'm really sorry for it." Yeah. And I always wore T-shirts and jeans. I never wore a suit in my life in the jail. And he said, "And Tim, why are you in jail?" And I said, "Because I'm the prison psychologist, Jimmy." It was just one of those priceless moments, and it cut to an ad break. They sort of had the blue rinse set there and the white shoe brigade, all the old ladies.
I could imagine.
Yeah, it was just one of those moments. But it was a very popular program, but it shut down for who knows why reasons. We tried to get a similar program going in Victoria, and I was involved as a consultant to that. And interestingly, it didn't work. And the reason it didn't work was because the prison officers became too involved with it. Right. And they were getting a bit heavy with the referrals, whereas in New South Wales they were trained to stay away. Yeah. Because it's about insight. And if you hear something from someone who's done the yards, you're more likely to pay attention and learn from it.
Well, I think a 17-year-old full of testosterone and wants to be a tough guy, if he came up in the prisons to explain what life in jail was actually about, I can imagine that being a reality check before they've gone in and been broken and changed.
Absolutely. And you're on this trajectory because, 10 years ago, son, I was just like you. Yeah. And now I've got 20 years of hard time to look forward to if I'm lucky with something.
Because it is interesting speaking to the older crooks, and they look back and they identify the sliding door moments. If only someone, had told me this to start with. So
we've all had them, but with these guys it was more extreme. I mean, the interesting thing is back then I mentioned car stealing and it was petty crime, whereas I'm sure you saw this in the police. You've now got 17, 18-year-olds who are charged with very serious criminal matters, armed robberies, murders, or drug dealing. It's a different dimension altogether.
Yeah, there's not a stepping stone. It's straight into first grade.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so Parramatta, other things in there, the brutality of it and the sexual assaults in the jail, I think it was notorious for that. What is the sexuality in prison? Is it about power, where prisoners get attacked? Or
it's about sexual release and power and a fusion of power and libido. Right. So if they're in jail for 10, 15 years, even 2 years... as you mentioned, they're pumped up with testosterone and bad manners, and they'll assert themselves by raping younger prisoners. Yeah. And I, counselled a lot of people in my time there who were victims of very brutal sexual assaults, gang rapes, and you'd talk to the offenders. There was never any names, no pack drill, no one was ever dobbed in because that could be a death sentence. Yeah. But I used to talk to these guys and they'd say, "Look, I'm heterosexual, don't worry about that. But in here, you need a sexual outlet and you've got to assert yourself," and that's what it was.
That's what it was about. Yeah. What about drugs in the prison?
They were starting to get in as I was leaving.
Yeah.
So when I started in 78, the drug of choice was homebrew alcohol. So much so that they closed the jail bakery because the crooks were stealing the yeast to make home brews. And a typical Saturday then was fermenting a bit of pineapple with yeast. And, I don't know if you've ever smelt the stuff. It's just vile. And they would drink home brews and listen to the races if they could on hot radios. Yes. There was a jail book, yeah.
And so people can understand like the making of the alcohol, the prison alcohol. It was basically getting the pieces of fruit or vegetable or whatever and letting it ferment and mixing it with the yeast, and
That's it.
that created the home brew.
Dangerous stuff, and that's when all the fights would happen. But over that 3-year period, drugs were starting to come into the jails, and of course they're rampant now.
Yeah.
And I mentioned 3 people were murdered while I was there in the last year. That was all about drug wars between different wings, controlling the drug movement, and there were huge profits to be made.
Yeah.
So people would get it on the tick, and then people on the outside would pay for it. And if the payments weren't made, it was brutally reinforced that you should.
Yeah.
So that's what would happen. Of course, these days, drugs are everywhere in prisons, and it's a real problem in terms of managing moods and behaviour.
With the alcohol, it was argued by the prisoners that, it was their release, and, I can imagine them settling down or aiming for Saturday, listening to the races and having a quiet drink. Do you think that it was a blind eye was turned to it?
Oh, sure.
To let it go? Because I know, speaking, and this is only getting from the prisoner's point of view, that the authorities were quite happy to let a bit of marijuana pass around because it calmed everyone down, but it's the other drugs that can potentially cause problems.
I think that's right. And another great Harry Duffism,
Yeah.
he's deceased, but he wouldn't mind me saying this. There was a potential riot brewing in the yards at Parramatta.
Yep.
And he was extraordinary. He walked right into the middle of this angry crowd and told them they were idiots. They were going to lose all their privileges if they didn't go back to their cells immediately.
Yeah.
And then he said, and if you don't go back, I'm going to stop all the hammer coming in, referring to the heroin.
Heroin, yeah.
And they all just marched off single file into their cells. So certainly a blind eye was turned to it.
Yeah.
And not that I ever saw it directly, I must say, but
they're very creative prisoners. It always amazes me how they can construct a plan, whether that be their escape plan or whatever they're trying to manipulate the system. But I suppose they've got 24/7 to think about it.
Well, you'd be aware of the great Parramatta Jail tunnel.
Yeah. That's right.
I mean, talk about ingenuity. It makes the Great Escape pale in comparison. And these guys dug a tunnel under the jail grounds, and Parramatta was built on old catacombs. They used to bury people under the cells and so on. So once they got down there were tunnels, and they had got right through to the wall, and they were going to come up next door in the Parramatta Linen Service.
Yeah.
And they were 5 of the worst prisoners
When
in
was
the state.
that? Because I remember it.
Around about 79, 80
That's right.
from memory.
Yeah.
I first heard about it on the Sunday morning. I went to get the paper, and it was headline news.
Yeah.
And what had happened was that one of the lesser known crooks had been transferred into that wing.
Yeah.
And he had said, if you don't deal me into the game, I'm going to dob you all in. And so they said, yeah, you can come with us. He then rang his mother and told her to prepare for a Saturday night dinner, and he was going to be bringing 5 crooks home with him. I mean, as dopey as they come, right? True story.
Yeah.
And she flipped out, and she rang the authorities, and there'd been a whisper that there was a tunnel somewhere. Nobody could find it, and now they had better particulars. They found it, and I was much thinner then. I was able to get through the hole in the ground and have a look around. Cause
you actually went down
there? Yeah, I couldn't miss the opportunity. But the hole was tiny.
Yeah.
And it was covered up, and they were getting rid of sand during the day out in the yards.
What, out in the exercise yard?
Yeah.
So not similar to the Great Escape.
Not dissimilar at all.
The World War II.
There was another guy who'd worked for the old Postmaster General as a linesman, and he hotwired the governor's phone into his cell through those similar catacombs in a cell, a wing that was really next to the administration block there. And he used to make calls, All this stuff would go on all the time. It was extraordinary. And I often said, if you guys turned your energy into productive, lawful pursuits, you'd all do very well.
I do find that with criminals, and especially when I see the drug dealers, the organised crime figures, that have got enough money that they could retire. Been there, done that, retire, but something keeps attracting them back to it.
I think it's the adrenaline, and it's the art of the deal. I mean, we'll talk about Alan Bond later, but I remember Alan when I was a kid. He was everybody's hero, and I thought if I ever got to meet the guy, I would ask him why he didn't stop.
Yeah.
I mean, he was a multi-millionaire in his 20s. So, of course, he became my client. And when I did meet him, I said, why didn't you stop? And he said, you don't understand, Tim. It was never about the money. It was the deal.
Yeah.
He loved doing deals. And I think it's the same with crooks. They love the adrenaline and they love the chase.
There is a lifestyle. There's in your book. There was one that I mentioned to you when we're talking in preparation that just sort of made me laugh, and it probably shouldn't make me laugh. It's a little bit sad, but the gentleman, he was a fraudster that embezzled some funds and was in prison. I think you described him as a person that you thought, well, this is actually one person that probably shouldn't be in jail and definitely won't come back to jail.
Yep.
But he found himself back in jail, and you uncovered the reason why he was back in jail. Could you tell us that?
Yeah, he was in jail vernacular. He was a squarehead. He was an accountant, and of all the places to put a guy, Parramatta Jail, but they recognised his talents with figures very quickly, and he became the bookkeeper in the prison, the administrative clerk, and we had various chats about why he was in jail. And he said I did the wrong thing, but he never really told me.
Yeah.
And he got parole very soon. He was only in for about 6 months, and I thought, well, that's the end of him. Well, fast forward 6 months and he's back there doing the same job, happier than a pig in shit, bluntly. Yeah. And I said, what are you doing here?
Why are you back in jail?
Why are you back in jail? And he said, look, I've got to tell you, it's my marriage. And I just haven't got the guts to end my marriage. And I thought if I kept offending, my wife might ditch me. I said, mate, it's a very destructive way of dealing with a marital problem. You're serious? So I called her in.
Yeah.
And I said, you need to talk to Thelma or whoever she was about what the issues are. And
John's got something to tell you.
Yeah, that's it. John's got something to say. He said, oh, look, I've always loved you, and but it's a bit stale, and I've been coming to jail hoping you'd dump me. And she said, you're officially dumped. And she stormed out, and that was it. But he didn't come back to jail. No.
Did you feel better after that?
He felt better.
Well, that must have given you some satisfaction, helping a little bit relationship advice.
What I thought was interesting is the conniptions and convolutions that people go through to deal with a straightforward problem, to avoid confrontation. And in his case, he was happy to go to jail rather than upset his wife, even though she'd been upsetting him unknowingly for decades.
Yeah.
Extraordinary stuff.
It is interesting. I suppose it's better in my line of work. I saw it the opposite end where they'd kill their wife because they were too afraid to. And I say it jokingly. I shouldn't be joking about it, but quite often people committed a murder because they couldn't bring themselves the shame of saying that I want to separate from you. So
I've seen that
powerful.
too. Yeah. It's so misguided, and it gets back to what we were discussing. If you could intervene earlier and give people problem-solving skills. I mean, I've been an advocate for decades saying that we should be introducing this sort of problem-solving stuff into primary school curriculum. Beyond the 3 R's, teach kids how to communicate, how to solve problems, how to recognise anger, and all those sorts of things. And I think if we did that, it would be a big step in terms of deflecting a lot of the violence that they experience later in life.
I think that's a very sensible approach because quite often the violence, from what I've seen, is an expression because they don't know how else to express the anger or the torment they're going through.
And it then reaches a point and it explodes.
Yeah.
And it's not hard for people to be taught to recognise anger as it's escalating and how it's percolating along.
Well, referencing your book again, and because there's so many just interesting stories, there's another gentleman that you said that was in Parramatta prison. I can't remember if you mentioned him by name, but he murdered his wife because he came home from the pub and found his wife engaged in sexual activity with another gentleman. He jumped out the window and he struck the wife, who fell downstairs and died. What was his story, or what as a person?
Believe it or not, he was a very decent guy. And he was full of remorse, and every year, getting into the anniversary of when the offence had occurred, he would hibernate in his cell for weeks.
Yeah.
And he just couldn't cope with what he had done. He had a responsible position in the prison where he would look after the younger prisoners.
Yep.
His nickname was Bruiser.
Right.
And nobody would muck around with Bruiser.
Well, if you got a nickname of Bruiser,
He was a solid, powerful guy, but a decent human being. But he couldn't cope with it. And, of course, alcohol being the lubricant for violent crime, when you can't cope with stress, it was just the wrong mixed at the wrong time.
And grieving on the anniversary or whatever, it wasn't for himself. It was grieving because he loved the woman that he killed. And,
couldn't believe what he'd done.
Yeah.
No, he didn't want to get out. He eventually did get out, but he felt the punishment was just.
Right, that's interesting. Well, it says something about the type of person he is, I would imagine.
They're all not like that, as we know.
Yeah.
But he was a decent guy, and he had to be punished. What he did was wrong, but he moved on with his life as best I know.
What's your observations of prisons, and is it something that rehabilitates where it is now? Is there things that you think that could serve the community better, not just the prisoners?
Arguably not. I don't think the dynamics have changed at all.
Right.
You still have internecine wars within the crook subgroup. It's still seen very much as a place of punishment, which it needs to be.
Yeah.
I'm no bleeding heart about this at all.
Yeah.
There's a lot of programs that are available to people. The great irony is, I mentioned when I started, there were very few psychologists, and people were reluctant to see a jail psychologist. Just as an aside, I'll tell you how I got around that one, almost by accident. The first week I was there, only one guy came to see me.
Yeah.
And I didn't smoke much.
Yeah.
But I might have had a cigarette a week, but I had a packet of Benson and Hedges, extra mild, in my pocket.
Yep.
And the guy came in and he saw the cigarette, and I could see that he was coveting it. And I said, would you like a smoke?
Yeah.
And he said, I'd love a smoke. And I said, would you like some proper coffee? Because in jail they had White Ox tobacco and Gibson's jailhouse coffee.
Yeah.
And so he had a cigarette and a coffee, and we had a chat, just shot the breeze for a while. The next day, 5 guys turned up because the word had got out, if you go and see the psycho, as I was known, you'd get a cigarette and a good cup of coffee. And so by the end of 2 weeks, I had a full book.
A bit of bribery always helps.
Behaviour modification.
Oh, right.
Anyway, they modified me because by the time I left the jail, I had this raging nicotine addiction. You know, I was going through about 30 smokes a day, first thing in the morning, last thing at night. So when I moved to Melbourne, I managed to give it away.
Yeah.
And I haven't smoked since. But
I would look from a police point of view, if I saw in my early days in the policing career someone getting round with White Ox, I could basically tell that
they'd done time. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because no one else had smoked it.
Oh, it was terrible stuff. Yeah. So I was saying the irony is, people didn't want to see the psychologist back then, but if you knew what you were doing, you could get some traction. Nowadays, there's a lot of psychologists. There's some really good programs, and I have a lot of respect for the people who run them and have set them up. But they're under-resourced because everyone in jail wants to see a psychologist and get involved in these programs, and the supply of mental health practitioners can't meet the demand. And I think more resources and money should be put into that area, employing more mental health practitioners, because there's a huge cost benefit to the community if you can address these people's problems in jail, reduce the risk of recidivism, reoffending, going back to jail. The money you'd spend on employing a psychologist would easily be covered in saving one bloke from jail, which is, 150,000, 200,000 a year in maximum security or more.
Yeah, there's financial benefits by treating the problem before it gets to that extent.
And the community benefits as well.
100%. We've talked about, and again, before we move on past the jails, we've talked about prisoners, and you understood the people that were in jail and some of the reasons, and you had empathy with them or could understand where they've come from. You would have also seen, I would imagine, people that you think, well, this is the only place for them in prison.
A lot of people deserve to be in jail, and they are really beyond redemption in terms of what they've done. People who abduct and kill children, for example, people who break into houses and rape women and other people, contract killers, you can go on, and people who import drugs.
Yeah.
Not the end of the day user, who's really a victim in many ways of that system, but those who are profiting on the lives of others. I think deserve everything they get.
You mentioned contract killers, and I found in my career they're some of the most, I won't say chilling, because I've seen what I consider sort of pure evil. Contract killers, I struggle to find empathy for. They're a type of themselves. Have you had dealings or much dealings with contract killers?
I have, not that I'd ever name them.
Yeah, no.
But
To take someone's life for financial.
it's just a transaction, as you know. It's they kill you as easily as they swat a fly or drive to McDonald's. They don't think twice about it, as long as the payment's good.
Yeah.
And, to me, that's pure psychopathy,
Yeah.
where there's no empathy at all, no sense of what you're doing. Beyond taking a life, the impact of the loss of that life on people who love that person.
Yeah.
It's just really disgusting, and it goes on.
Yeah, well, my dealing with one, and I can talk about him because he's now deceased, is Sean Waygood, and a contract killer, and I spent many hours or days sitting there talking to him, and he's trying to justify it in his own mind. Like I've sat opposite a lot of killers, unless they're psychopaths. Generally, at some point in time, you'll see the emotion come out. But with this particular person, he's just trying to justify his actions the whole time, and I found it quite chilling.
Well, they blame others for what they're doing because they don't want to own their behaviour.
Have you met him? Yeah.
Mate, there's a template.
Yeah.
And, it doesn't matter where they are, what country they're from. The psychological dynamics are pretty similar, if not identical.
Yeah.
And, of course, there's a hierarchy of contract killers too. The very successful ones, they're never caught. It's just a business and they live other lives.
Yeah.
But it's an extraordinary thing. And to me, it's an extraordinary thing that you would take money to kill someone, let alone kill one another anyway.
Yes. Yeah.
It's a terrible thing.
There's something that it's hard to relate to in any sense of the matter. So you've got out of Parramatta, or when I say you got out of Parramatta,
I got out on parole.
Yeah, you got out.
I'm still serving parole
for good behaviour, and then you set up a consultancy business, and you were working in Sydney and Melbourne.
I was. The day in jail program that I mentioned led to me giving a paper at a conference in Melbourne.
Yep.
And I'd met a forensic psychiatrist down there, David Syme, deceased. And after that conference, he said that was a great paper and you should think about coming to Melbourne to work with me.
Yep.
And I was very flattered. He was one of the top guys in Melbourne. But I lived in Balmain, I liked my job. My house was between two pubs and I had an active social life. The idea of going to Melbourne...
Jail really had an impact on you.
Well, I sort of, I enjoyed where I was. And, I didn't have any real intentions of leaving Sydney, but he made me an offer that was too good to refuse, which was to work with him as an independent consultant. He would refer me work. He became an immense mentor for me. So I would sit in on his sessions and I learned a lot about what was going on. So again, another very steep learning curve. So eventually I decided to leave the job and I worked in Sydney and Melbourne for a little while. And then I just made the big plunge and moved to Melbourne in about October 81.
Right. And the role that you perform, like giving expert evidence in courts, can you explain what that is, the purpose of that you're determining if someone is suffering some mental illness? You've also got to rule on insanity if a person's been convicted, because insanity is very rarely used as a defence.
And sorry, go on.
But there's degrees of mental health that might come in to play when a court is deciding on a sentence of an offender.
Yeah, that's quite right. I mean, I would say 95% of what I've done over the last 40 years at least has been the sentencing process rather than the fitness to plead process,
right,
which is more the province, I think, of psychiatry. But, when they had capital punishment in Australia, a lot of people would go for insanity as a defence because it would spare them from the gallows. Once that stopped, people started doing deals and, people go to trial, but it's probably less prevalent and the mental state is less of an issue unless they're glaringly crazy or glaringly intellectually disabled and so on. So most of what I do is assessing people ahead of sentence hearings. But you look at exactly the same things. You look at their history, you look at childhood trauma, family dynamics, educational history, medical history, drug and alcohol history. You might administer some psychological tests, and then through this sort of arcane process, you put it all together in a report that goes before the judge. Certainly in the 80s and 90s, I was giving viva voce or on-the-spot evidence in the witness box probably 2 to 3 times a week.
Right, okay.
And it was very busy from that point of view, and I was involved in a number of trials. But in more recent years, things, because of time efficiencies, tend to be just done on the papers.
Right.
So you're rarely called to swear up to the report you've written,
Right.
unless it's highly contentious. And I've always seen myself as an advisor to the court, although it's an adversarial system and although you're called by the defence. Ultimately, you're giving objective evidence for the benefit of the court and the community. And I've seen people come and go who are mavericks, who become known as purely defence people, who they're advocating for the accused person. I think you have to maintain your objectivity. And if you do that, it has a valuable role to play in terms of the sentencing process. Judges like to know, does the person have any redemption? Is the person sorry? What sort of treatment, if any, is going to affect this person and ultimately benefit the community? And as an expert, you can speak to those issues with some coherence.
Well, that certainly should be a factor that judges take into account upon sentencing, all those things that you're talking about.
Well, they do, and I think that's why psychology in the courts is now so prevalent. Back in 81, when I moved to Melbourne, there were 4 of us doing this sort of work.
Yep.
I couldn't count how many now, probably hundreds.
When you say 4, you're talking state?
Statewide, this is psychologists, and I think
Yep.
there are about 4 forensic psychiatrists
Yes.
who are engaged full-time assessing prisoners and giving evidence in the court. But I think the utility of what we do is better accepted now, and consequently it's almost mandatory that a psych report is called for either by the defence or the judge. They want to know what's going on. So I think that in itself speaks to the value of what we're doing.
And it is from my experience, it is it is widely accepted in the courts now as a valuable tool in determining the sentence.
Yeah, and I think part of the reason behind that is that it's recognised that we're not there as part of the defence team so much. We may be retained by the defence or the Crown, but predominantly the defence, and we're there to advise the court about critical issues that may assist the court.
Yeah, I think that's a perception. I know it's a perception held within police sometimes that someone's been called by the defence, therefore it must support the defence's case. But if it works and works properly, an expert witness should be independent of defence or prosecution and merely advising the court.
I agree. And why shouldn't the court be appraised of that evidence and that information about somebody? Because otherwise you just judge people the same in terms of what they've done. But as you would know from your vast experience, behind every crime there's a story.
Yeah.
And there are similar themes, but every story in itself is unique.
I'm going to take you here and again extracts from your book, and I thoroughly recommend reading your books. And I've seen a lot, done a lot, but each time I turned the page, I thought, "What are we in for now?"
It's a roller coaster.
It is a roller coaster. You're one of the first consultancy jobs that you had. You were flown to, it's down in Melbourne, you were flown to a country town and to speak to your client, which he'd been arrested. As your understanding, he'd been arrested for a break and enter offence, but there was a lot more to the story.
I was conned. I was contacted, and it was in that transitional period of living in Sydney and Melbourne, and it was a law firm in Mildura, Hillards. And they said, "Look, we've got a break and enter case for you." And I thought, boy, this is pretty special. They're going to fly me from Sydney to Melbourne and get a small plane up to Mildura just for a break and enter case.
You felt the...
I felt special,
Yeah.
And I was, how old I was then? I was just 28.
So
I was
people
a
are
young
starting
bloke.
to realise your expertise. And
Yeah, but really I was naive too. These days I'd ask for a lot more information before I signed up. So I go out to the Mildura police cells because they were holding cells, and even then the lawyer hadn't given me all the material. But he said, it's break and enter, and there's a bit of bestiality as well, low voice. And I said, what?
Just slip that in.
He slipped it in as he was dropping me off and sped off. Yeah. So there's this old burly station sergeant, and he said, what do you want? And I said, Tim Watson-Munro, psychologist. I'm here to see Mr. Smith. I've anonymised him. He might still be alive. And he said, you mean Chuka Smith, mate? And I said, what do you mean, Chuka? And he yelled out, he said, hey, boys, there's a psycho here to see Chuka Smith. And everybody in the police cells, all the other crooks, started squawking like chooks, going, quack, 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 making donkey noises, whining like horses and barking. And he said, mate, your guy's been caught rooting chickens. He's been breaking and entering into chicken coops and breaking and entering again. So armed with that, I thought, where do I go from here? So I interviewed the guy, and every Sunday he would break into this particular chicken coop, and the chickens would die. It's not funny, of course, but
I'm sitting here half with a shocked look on my face. It's
awe-inspiring. I was gobsmacked. And eventually the guy who owned the farm thought it was a fox, but a very wily fox.
So every Sunday there was a pattern to when
there was a pattern.
Fence. Yeah,
I would have thought it was a very smart fox if it knew just to come on Sundays. But so on this particular Sunday he drove off and then doubled back with a shotgun and heard all the squawking in the chicken coop, and he went in and there was this guy with a chook, and he chased him, and the guy couldn't get rid of the chicken, and he shot him in the backside, and he was arrested. So that was the first case I'd done as a private practitioner, and it was extraordinary. He wanted to sue the owner of the farm. No names, no pack drill, but he was a very heavy guy.
The wrong person's
chicken coop. And I said, look, I wouldn't be doing this. I wouldn't be suing him. I think you're being caught, and let's look at why this has happened. He had no remorse at all. He couldn't see what was wrong with it.
So I think I've seen people like that, and I haven't seen the extent that you're talking about there with the chicken man, but in their own minds, it's nothing to be ashamed of.
Well, he didn't have a lot of shame, and I wondered if he was intellectually disabled, but he wasn't.
Yeah.
He was an itinerant farm worker who just had a particular thing for chickens, and he went to jail. It was a very difficult sentencing hearing. The judge was as bewildered as I was. And the judge had been on the bench for 20 years or so.
You gave evidence, did you?
Yeah. I saw him. I went back to the law office and did the report, and then I gave evidence later that day.
Yeah,
and the lawyer apologised. He said, I probably should have told you a bit more.
Did I miss to tell you about him raping chickens?
Just an essential detail. And then I went down to the Grand Hotel in Mildura. I don't know if you've been there. It's a great pub. And I had a beer and caught a plane home, and that was my entree into criminal psychology at the very, very sharp end.
You get that type of experience, and each thing it garnishes your own experience to build on it. And you've been in the field now for 42 years, so I'm sure there's not a lot that would shock you, because we'd tell a story like that, and you don't know whether the laugh cry or just be in shock. It's just horrendous, but there's people out there like that.
Well, I think the shock has prevailed. I mean, I still remember the story like it was yesterday, and even though at that stage I'd had 3 years at Parramatta and I thought I'd seen it all, this was another dimension altogether, because the people I saw in prison was after the sentencing process.
Yep.
This was, during the sentencing process, and the thing that struck me the most was the fact that he had no sense of regret about what he'd done and no insight to the perverse nature of his behaviour. I thought that was extraordinary.
So from a layman's point of view, we'd be going, he's insane, but he's not in fact insane, is he?
It's a very good point. His behaviour to most is insanity. I mean, who wants to have sex with a chicken or any other animal for that matter? but legally not insane, because the definition of legal insanity is you have to not know or be aware of what you're doing or the consequences of your actions.
Right.
So people who are, psychotic, they see spaceships, Jesus is talking to them. If they've got some sort of hallucination or delusion, they are legally, medically insane.
So his sanity, it comes across in the fact that he snuck in when there was no one watching to have sex with the chickens.
He planned it, not once, but several times.
Yeah.
He stalked the chickens.
Yeah.
And he knew the difference between right and wrong. He had a psychiatric diagnosis. He was a paraphile, which is a sexual pervert in common parlance.
Yeah.
But behaviour's bad. Some would say insane, but he's not legally insane to the point where he didn't know what he was doing. I guess that's the best way of explaining it. You've got to know what you're doing, and you've got to know the consequences of what you're doing. You've got to know the difference between right and wrong.
And you said paraphile or paraphilia.
Yeah.
And is that someone's sexual attraction to, it can be an innate object, it can be all sorts of things, or?
Oh, there's a number of paraphilias.
Yeah.
Voyeurism, exhibitionism, bestiality, pedophilia.
Yeah.
All those sort of sexual perversions, as we know them, are broadly described as paraphiles or paraphilia. Yeah.
And again, and taking people into a world that probably don't understand, there's someone that had sexual attraction to exhaust pipes.
Same dynamic, different arousal. Right. So this guy would hide behind bushes in parkland generally, and he would wait for the person to park the car to go for a walk, and he knew exactly when to strike, and he would fellate the exhaust pipes, and he found it very exciting and satisfactory from a sexual point of view. Now, to us, again, that's got to be insanity, but it's not. It's just a form of sexual perversion.
Right. My experience in homicide and dealing with murders, that I always understand the power of the sex drive that can lead to crimes. And have you found that in your work, that sex is such a powerful driver for things to happen?
Absolutely. And I'm not Freudian, but he's very Freudian. I think that behind all these things, sex is a motivator and a driver. And it's all about ego, and it's about ownership, power, possessiveness, sexual jealousy, sexual impotence. I've assessed people that have killed women because they've commented on the size of their genitalia or their performance, and the way that they then reassert their power is by bashing them and killing them. So sex is a very powerful driver, and I guess hand in glove with that, a lot of the drugs that are on the street now, like ice, it enhances libido. Right. So people's libido goes off the chart, their judgment goes out the window. It affects the prefrontal cortex of the brain, which is responsible for judgment, forward planning, consequential thinking, those sorts of things. And so you've got a deadly cocktail there, potentially, with ice, sexual drive, and violence, and, sexual violence as well.
And the crime's the culmination of all that coming together.
Wrong place, wrong time, and wrong drug.
Tim, in regards to crimes and something that's widespread and prevalent, and I think it's been around for a long time, but it's certainly out in the public more often, is the church's institutionalised sexual abuse of people within churches or other organisations such as that. What's your take on that, why people offend in organisations like that? You must have spoken to people that have been involved in those organisations. Have you got an understanding of why those organisations attract that type?
It's the same dynamic. And back in the 90s, I was retained by Slater and Gordon. There was a class action against the Christian Brothers, referable to the Bindoon boys in Western Australia and the Clontarf boys. These were kids who were sent out from Europe during World War II to save them from the ravages of the war and the Nazis and the fascists in Italy. And they effectively became slave labour to the church. At the end of the war, the parents were told the kids had died, and a few of them had, and the parents were told their kids had died. And so it was institutional cruelty It was a terrible situation. And so I was exposed at the very raw end of this to the abuse they experienced. And it was interesting because I can recall going into the waiting room. Slater and Gordon made their offices available to me in West Perth. And I could tell the people who were the litigants. They sat differently. They looked different to other people who were in the waiting room. They were all singularly and collectively broken men.
Right.
And I saw, 30 or 40 of them over a period of time in Perth and Sydney, and I think a few in Melbourne. And the dynamics were exactly the same. The stories were the same. They were bullied. There was sexual abuse, unbridled, because they were not accountable, the Christian Brothers.
Yeah.
And these kids would be groomed, beaten up. They'd have sex with them and then beat them up again as punishment. So it's little wonder that when they eventually got out of that system, they found it extraordinarily difficult to cope with normal society.
Yeah.
They all became heavy drinkers, failed marriages, severe depression, no self-esteem. As to why do people do it, I think there's some very good people in the clergy, whatever your faith may be.
Yeah.
And I have great respect for those genuine people. They do a good job. But that said, there are certainly a number of people within those institutions who are drawn to the job because of the opportunity it affords them.
Right.
Whether it be the church, whether it be the scouts. I mean, I couldn't tell you the number of scoutmasters I've assessed over the years who are charged with child sex offences.
Yeah.
But I don't want to, defame scouting. I think there's some very genuine people who do the right thing. And generally when these things come to the fore and there's knowledge of it, the people are dismissed, and these days they're reported to the police and they're punished.
Yeah.
But I don't know, opportunity creates badness for some.
The opportunity, I can see them acting as predators and putting themselves in that environment. Is there that power imbalance too, that they feel that they're entitled to get away with it?
Totally. Entitlement in the sense that they won't be caught, and using that power to subjugate the victim. So they'll groom them, they'll make them feel special, they'll take them for special outings, all the rest of it, and then at some point they jump on them. Certainly that's been my observation. It's a sense of entitlement.
Yeah.
And again, some of them express remorse, but you really have to wonder. It's more about sorrow about being caught, I think, for some of them.
That's their remorse.
Yeah.
Oh, me, oh my, I've been caught.
You found that?
Yeah. I look, and with pedophiles too, in my dealings with pedophiles, ones that stay under the radar, some are overt and you can spot them a mile away. Others, and it confuses people when they're being charged with being a pedophile, because people go, I just didn't see it. That's Uncle such and such, or, he was a good bloke. He was always there. He's helping this. They're very skilled at masking. They're master manipulators, I think, a pedophile that has got away with it for a long time. They can manipulate the environment.
I agree. And that's why it's so... The offending, once it starts, escalates and becomes more and more frequent.
Yeah.
And it's generally... historically, people didn't come forward. They might have told their parents say, don't be stupid, that couldn't have happened. We know Father O'Flaherty, he's a good man.
Yeah,
and similarly with the Scouts. Whereas now I think one of the good things about social media, people talking about it, there's been films and documentaries made about it.
Yeah.
People feel validated, and out of that comes strength to come forward and talk about their own experiences.
Yeah.
And I'm noticing now in terms of my practice, there's a lot of people being charged over historical child sex offences which occurred 30 or 40 years ago. And people in their 50s and 60s are coming forward and saying, when I was in the Scouts, this happened to me.
Yeah.
And generally these people plead guilty because there's similar fact evidence and there's nowhere to go with it.
Yeah, it's amazing when you hear of a person being charged with something and it hits the media and all the other people come out. So you wonder just how widespread it has been. And let's just thinking from the victim's point of view too here, how difficult it would be for them, and you'd see the damage years down the track. If you had an offence like that and you've gone to someone that first of all, it's someone that you're supposed to trust committing the offence, and then you've gone to another person to report it and there was no help coming, you can see why they're damaged and broken people.
The lack of validation is very important, and it's good that they get the courage to do it. And I think there's now an onus for people to take these complaints seriously, and that seems to be happening as well.
Yeah.
Certainly in my profession, it's mandatory that you report it if you hear about it. I think that's a good thing.
Yeah. Before we move on past that, serial sex offenders like rapists, and I've in the course of my career, I've worked on a couple where they're particularly violent rapists, and there's a pattern in that. You've no doubt in your time in the prisons, but also dealing with clients, come across the rapists, the serial type rapists. Is something that is unique about them, or what's your take on those?
It's a career for some of them. They enjoy it. Nothing else is as exciting or pleasurable for them. And once they get away with it, they keep doing it, or they can keep doing it. It generally starts with masturbatory fantasies, pornography, that then escalates in terms of its intensity, and they reach a point where they want to act it out because they really get a thrill out of controlling other people, stalking them, even if they don't stalk them in a long-term setting, but seizing the day, seizing the opportunity, and sexually humiliating the victim, whether the victim be male or female, that occurs.
That you mentioned stalking. Stalking's an offence that throughout my career, and I'm not talking major crime investigation, I'm talking from the time in uniform. Stalking is an offence that always caused me concern. I think when you've got someone that's got the potential to stalk, as in being told stay away, and they keep coming back or that type of thing. I have grave concerns when I come up in an investigation when someone's stalking. What's your take on the personality types? Or
I think they're potentially very dangerous people because they can't control their behaviour, or they feel justified in what they're doing, and they become fixated on the person they're stalking. And so rejection can make them angry and can cause to an escalation in terms of consequences for the victim. And I think they're very dangerous people. And the law is dealing with them accordingly. It's a bad thing to stalk people.
I agree, and I see it even with domestic situations too. You see the domestic violence, and invariably you see where a partner's been killed. There's been stalking leading up to it, or harassment, that type of thing.
They're outraged that somebody could reject them. So underneath it all, there's strong feelings of inadequacy as well. But there's a sense of entitlement that your partner becomes your chattel in the way the budgie does, or the dog, or your car, and nobody's going to own my chattel. And generally the trigger for this is when the person finds another partner, because that's finito for the relationship, and all those dynamics then crystallise, and they become very dangerous potentially. Not all, but certainly you've seen it, I've seen it, and it needs to be taken seriously.
Yeah, it's one offence that I've always thought sometimes it's not because no physical damage has been done. There's and it's hard to quantify, but it's something that scared me when I'm come up against someone that's stalking, the potential for the danger that can happen down the track.
Yeah, and even if they're not killed, the psychological impact on the victim is huge. They become scared to go outdoors. They become, perhaps not paranoid, realistically anxious about what's going on.
Yep.
And they worry for themselves and their families. And, of course, social media has enabled this to the nth degree. So people can now stalk people on social media, trolling, all that sort of stuff.
It's on another level, isn't it? Really?
It's on another level.
Yeah.
And it's you've got to be very careful about what you put out in cyberspace, I think.
All right. Well, this has been a very light first hour of a conversation. So it's probably time we take a break, take a breath, because I certainly need to readjust.
You need to decompress.
Decompress. There's been some heavy stuff talked about, but it is quite fascinating, but it's certainly a strange world that you've inhabited. When we get back to part 2 of Tim on Eye Catch Killers, we're going to talk about some of Tim's more infamous and well-known clients and his very honest and raw account about his own $2,000 a week cocaine habit. Was that right, Tim? 2,000?
Give or take 100.
Give or take 100, okay. Which led to criminal charges, which I'm certainly in no position to judge about criminal charges. Hasn't everyone got the criminal charges? And being disbarred from practicing, and how you turn that around and use your experience to help others. And we'll also talk about some of your interesting clients, including Alan Bond, You've also dealt with Mick Howie.
Yes.
Yeah, and so we'll have an interesting discussion there. So let's take a break and debrief and get back to it shortly.
Look forward to it, mate. Thank you.
Cheers. This podcast series is brought to you by True Crime Australia. Visit icatchkillers.com.au for additional material such as articles on what you heard, videos and galleries. You can search for the I Catch Killers with Gary Jubilant official group on Facebook and join in with discussion. See you for the next episode of the podcast.